A theory isn't a theory unless you can test it. Not falsify it, test it and demonstrate it. And when you're trying to prove your theory, one of the things that you do is you take all the directions from which people could say it's wrong, you test those and demonstrate that it's not wrong from those directions. So in the end, you're doing most of what Karl Popper's saying, most of it. But Karl Popper's saying it all wrong. He's saying you've got to falsify your theory. Wrong, wrong. You've got to prove it true. You don't go and look for ways to prove it wrong. You go and look for ways to prove it right. And an objective scientist will try to prove it right by taking all the directions from which it could be proved wrong and testing and demonstrating them. So it's just bad, poor taste. Now he mentions on page 47 that philosophers and theologians who are trying to resolve difficult intellectual problems, quote, they must make themselves familiar with those difficulties in their most puzzling form, and this cannot be accomplished unless they are freely stated and placed in the most advantageous light they can admit of. So they're going to have to, in order to solve intellectual problems, philosophers have to be able to speak of them freely without any worries, including theologians. Now, that's the interesting tidbit we're about to get here, is what he says about the Catholic Church. Quote, the Church has its own way of dealing with this embarrassing problem. It makes a broad separation between those who can be permitted to receive its doctrines on conviction and those who must accept them on trust. Neither, indeed, are allowed any choice as to what they will accept, but the clergy, such at least as can be fully confided in, may admissibly and meritoriously make themselves acquainted with the arguments of opponents in order to answer them, and may therefore read heretical books. You might censor things, but there has to be a censor to censor them. If you censor hardcore pornography, someone has to sit and watch hardcore pornography all day and decide what's admissible and what isn't. And as Hitchens said, isn't it a famous story about the old man who himself becomes depraved while trying to keep society from becoming depraved by watching over them, censoring them. And the church has this problem. If these books, the banned books, if they're bad, if these ideas are bad, if even listening to them is bad, and if you should just have faith in the Lord, then they are going to be a very intellectually weak organization. If they're going to face their opponents, then they have to know their opponents' arguments. So, quote, this discipline recognizes a knowledge of the enemy's case as beneficial to the teachers, but finds means consistent with this of denying it to the rest of the world, thus giving to the elite a more mental culture, though not more mental freedom, than it allows to the mass. By this device it succeeds in obtaining the kind of mental superiority which its purpose requires. For though culture without freedom never made a large and liberal mind, it can make a clever nisi prius advocate of a cause. Now I'm not sure what nisi prius means, but culture without freedom doesn't make a liberal mind, but it may produce a clever mind. Quote, but in countries professing Protestantism, this resource is denied, since Protestants hold, at least in theory, that the responsibility for the choice of religion must be borne by each for himself, and cannot be thrown upon teachers. So the Catholic Church may do that, but the Protestants don't. Quote, besides, in the present state of the world, it is practically impossible that writings which are read by the instructed can be kept from the uninstructed. If the teachers of mankind are to be cognizant of all that they ought to know, everything must be free to be written and published without restraint. Now, an interesting thought he puts there, in the present state of the world, it's impossible to keep the writings from the uninstructed. It would have been more possible back when books were insanely expensive and written by hand. But once they became quite cheap and were printed, then they're just too widespread. So it's a change of technology that led to a more liberal society. Now he says that if the mischievous operation of the absence of free discussion were confined to leaving men ignorant of the grounds of their opinions, it might be thought that this is not really that bad. This is no moral evil. So if you're doing, if the people believe a good thing or the right thing or the true or the moral thing, then why do they need to understand it or grasp the real reasons for it? Now, I'll just interject there. He's going to go on and we'll get what he says, but I'll just interject an objectivist thought there. I think it's Huron Brooke, but it's maybe some other objectivist thinker who actually did a course. The CDs are available for purchase, called "The Right Action for the Wrong Reason is the Wrong Action." Maybe, come to think of it, maybe that's a tagline out of some objectivist thing. But this is an objectivist idea, that if you do the right thing for the wrong reason, you've done the wrong thing. I did a video on this, and you can actually type that exact phrase in. The right action for the wrong reason is the wrong action, and it's probably exactly that phrase. It's the title of the video. So if you want more on that, there it is, but he goes on. The fact, however, is that not only the grounds of the opinion are forgotten in the absence of discussion, but too often the meaning of the opinion itself. So you cannot divorce an understanding of ideas from holding the ideas. There's no way to divorce them, says Mill, and objectivists agree with that. Quote, "The words which convey it cease to suggest ideas, or they suggest only a small portion of those they were originally employed to communicate. Instead of a vivid conception and a living belief, there remain only a few phrases retained by rote, or, if any part, the shell and husk only of the meaning is retained, the finer essence being lost." Well, there you have it. If you don't study and know the reasons for your opinions, then you don't have opinions on some very important level. Now, he says that this way of believing doctrines without, basically just as dead beliefs, without really understanding, he says that this is the manner in which the majority of believers hold the doctrines of Christianity. Quote, "By Christianity, I here mean the maxims and precepts contained in the New Testament. These are considered sacred and accepted as laws by all professing Christians. Not one Christian in 1,000 guides or tests his individual conduct by reference to those laws. The standard to which he does refer it is the custom of his nation, his class, or his religious profession." So, interesting point he makes there. He says Christians say they believe all this stuff, but not 1 in 1,000 actually guides their daily actions, their beliefs, their life, on what's actually in the New Testament. I was perplexed by this when I was a young man, living in Utah, fairly religious place, and I thought, how can people know what Jesus said and believe in Jesus and not do what he said? If you really believe that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven, or if you really believe that you should sell all your goods, give the money to the poor, and go preach and follow Jesus, if you really believe that, why aren't you doing it? So it's very, very hypocritical. I didn't really realize that at the time. I came to realize it over after my teenage years. In the early 20s, I started to realize that there are religions out there that are not hypocritical, like Islam. They really do what they say they believe. They believe that you can beat women, and they beat women. They believe that the Quran is the word of God, so what do? They cut off the hands of people that steal. They stone women to death for being adulterers. So, he noted a long time ago that Christians are hypocritical, that they don't actually do what Jesus said they should do, and easy to dismiss hypocrites, very easy. So a Christian, quote, has a collection of ethical maxims which are a compromise between the Christian creed and the interests and suggestions of worldly life. So one reason that you can't follow Christianity is because you would die. You just can't. And there is the occasional person who does follow Christianity, like monks, but even monks in this modern day and age aren't like they used to be. I certainly don't think more highly of somebody who follows Christianity with all fervor. I think they're even dumber than the people who profess belief in Christianity but don't follow it. But at least they have the moral uprightness to not be total hypocrites about their beliefs and actions. Quote, all Christians believe that the blessed are the poor and humble, and those who are ill-used by the world. That it is easier for a camel to da-da-da-da-da. That they should take no thought for the morrow. That if they would be perfect, they should sell all what they have and give to the poor. They are not insincere when they say that they believe these things. So he says they sincerely believe them. They believe them as people believe what they have always heard lauded and never discussed. So there we go. That's the point he's making, is that if you hold these opinions and don't discuss them, if everyone's just supposed to receive them and nod and say, yes, that's true, then everybody believes them and holds them and nods and says, yes, that's true. But since they don't really understand these, since they haven't discussed them, mulled them over, come to really grasp what these beliefs mean, they're not able to integrate them into their action. So it's part of the hypocrisy is the fact that religion has been pushed to the side, and we're not to discuss it, and we're not to have great respect for religious thinkers or anything like that. Religion's just sort of a thing that's there in life. Quote, but in the sense that living belief, which regulates conduct, they believe these doctrines just up to the point to which is usual to act upon them. So, right at the point where you're going to take action, they'll hedge their bet just a little bit. But as long as you're not asking them to take action, or as long as they aren't planning to take action, sure, they believe Christianity, sure. The doctrines in their integrity are serviceable to pelt adversaries with. Right? Anytime somebody criticizes somebody, you say, he who is without sin can cast the first stone. Right? Can pelt your adversaries. And it is understood that they are to be put forward when possible as the reasons for whatever people do that they think laudable. You do something that you think's good, you give a religious reason for it. You say, well, it says in the Bible that you should blah, blah, blah. But anyone who reminded them that the maxims require an infinity of things which they never even think of doing would gain nothing but to be classed among these very unpopular characters who affect to be better than other people. So if you say to a Christian, you're not doing everything Christ said, you're not living up to Christianity, what you're going to get in return is they're going to say, well, nobody's perfect. Only Jesus was perfect. And you'll become one of these unpopular characters who affect to be better than others. And they'll say to you, I'm humble. I'm not perfect. I have flaws. Why do you think you're so good? And they turn the tables on you for pointing out their hypocrisy, says Mill, and I've seen it. The doctrines have no hold on ordinary believers. They are not a power in their minds. They have an habitual respect for the sound of them, but whenever conduct is concerned, they look round for Mr. A and Mr. B to direct them on how far to go in obeying Christ. So they check over their shoulder and see who's watching, and that's how they decide how far to go in obeying Christ. There's a joke about Mormons that is salient here. Never take a Mormon fishing with you. Always take at least 2 of them. Because if you take one, he'll drink all your beer. But if you take 2, they'll watch each other, and all the beer will be left for you. So, either take 2 Mormons or none with you. I'll just slip in one more little joke here. It's about Brigham Young University. There's a party, all young college kids partying. Some guy comes in and on the coffee table, he starts rolling up a joint. And immediately, all the girls in the room put their bras on and pull up their panties and they start leaving. They're not going to be around that stuff. Now, we may be well assured that the case was not thus, but far otherwise with the early Christians. So he says this vigor hasn't always been lacking. They used to have some vigor in their belief. Had it been thus, Christianity would never have expanded from an obscure sect of the despised Hebrews into the religion of the Roman Empire. So, early Christians really did do what they believed they should. They weren't hypocritical. They were more like Islam is now. And there's a note there's an ominous note in that for us nowadays, because if Islam believes so strongly, and if they are not hypocritical, if they do practice their religion, then their religion's likely to expand. And the reason that Christianity hasn't been expanding for a very long time and has been losing ground is because they are no longer fervor. They don't have fervor anymore. They simply mouth the platitudes and say, yes, I believe, I have faith. And they've lost the vigor. The culture's not growing, it's not gaining ground. People see it as inane, and it's losing ground to Islam, which is less hypocritical. Now, a brilliant thought related to that. This speaks to the fact that people relax when there aren't any problems, and when there are problems, people run to their battle stations. Quote, both teachers and learners go to sleep at their post as soon as there is no enemy in the field. Now that's exactly what we, for all intents and purposes, did after the Cold War. We went to sleep. The Cold War ended, Soviet Russia fell apart. We said, oh, everything's great now, it's fine. This is the end of history, as Fukuyama wrote. And everybody just went to sleep. And then September 11th happened, and we all have to wake up and get back to business again. But I remember in the 1990s, the biggest scandal of the entire decade was whether or not Clinton got a blowjob in the Oval Office. Absolutely boring. Just deadly boring decade. I can't believe we all made it through it. Continuing. Now he says that all languages and literatures are full of general observations on life, but most of these don't sink in for a person. He says, how often, when a person is smarting under some unforeseen misfortune or disappointment, they call to mind some proverb or common saying familiar to him all his life, the meaning of which would have saved him from the calamity, or the meaning of which now hits home for him, or whatever. There are many truths of which the full meaning cannot be realized until the personal experience has brought it home. Now, I'm not so sure a personal experience is necessary in all these cases, certainly in some, but a context is necessary, a motivation, an interest, a reason for it to sink into your mind. This is true not only of coming to a connection with some phrase out of the Bible or something. This is true of learning facts about history, the most inane facts about history that you don't think are very important, turn out to be fascinating and important when you have a context to learn them. Let me think of an example.